Just over a year ago, I made a video about the cycling mechanic. That video featured a brief history of the mechanic and associated decks, as well as a discussion of why I dislike a particular commander printed for the mechanic a few years ago. That video also features a brief description of my own cycling deck, a Shroom deck built around the card Astral Slide. That deck has endured more so than basically any other I've built. It's the only deck built before I started making YouTube videos that both still gets played regularly and also hasn't changed dramatically. However, the process of building it was also way different than that of the other decks I've built. My decks broadly tend to be less synergy focused and more play pattern focused, with deck dynamics being unusual, but the cards themselves being often somewhat more generic budget staples, rather than coming from a particular synergy package. This deck was a massive exception to that. Every card was meticulously chosen to perform hyper-specific roles and mesh with as many other cards as possible. For that reason, this deck ended up being easily my most difficult deck to build, thrusting me well outside my normal comfort zone of deck building. I actually left the deck unchanged for about a year, starting in mid to late 2023, purely because it was functioning okay, and I was terrified that any changes I haphazardly made would lead to the deck falling apart. Its mysterious special sauce getting tainted. However, late last year I decided that it was finally time to update the deck, both adding newly printed cards and smoothing out a handful of long-time issues. And with the success I've enjoyed with the deck since then, I figured I should give a full overview of how I built the deck, what makes it work, and what it says about how we as EDH players build decks. To start with, let's talk about the origins of the deck. The starting point for building it was browsing a card gallery of Onslaught cards and having a couple particular cards stand out to me. One of these was Astral Slide, a 3-mana white enchantment that flickers a creature whenever a card is cycled, and this offers an effective way to reuse ETBs and temporarily remove opposing creatures. The other card was Oversold Cemetery, a 2-mana black enchantment that returns a creature from its controller's graveyard to their hand on each of their upkeeps as long as there are 4 or more creatures in that graveyard. This effect can act as a recursion engine, enabled by cycling, and can also be used to simply keep up Astral Slide fodder. From there I decided that I also wanted blue, since that's a color that shares a lot of synergy elements with what I was building, and which also gives access to a nice range of commanders. After a brief commander hunt, I ended up settling on Shroom as an Esper commander with an impactful graveyard-oriented ETB. These 3 cards alone already paint a decently clear picture of the sort of deck I was going to be building, an ETB-centered cycling deck with artifact and graveyard sub-themes, some key enchantments, and enough creatures to get Oversold Cemetery online. If that sounds specific, it's because it is. Immediately a handful of challenges presented themselves, different conditions that my deck would need to fulfill in order to be even remotely functional. For one, the deck needs a lot of cycling cards for purposes of reliable Astral Slide triggers. I ended up deciding that a high 30s count was about right, and have stuck with around that number through various iterations of the deck. Secondly, a reasonably high creature count for Oversold Cemetery, at least 30. Thirdly, a way to find key cards. The deck relies on Astral Slide for its game plan, and there are only 3 cards that perform the function of Astral Slide, so some tutors to find them will be very helpful. Finally, the deck needs ways to get cards in its graveyard, with draw and discard effects seeming most appropriate. I found that 7 was basically as low as I could go for these. Okay, so this is immediately placing a lot of requirements on the deck, with the high 30s count of cycling cards being perhaps the most rigorous. Even if we consider the 14 available cycling lands in Esper colors and run all of them, which I do, that still means that we're looking at less than 40 available slots for non-land, non-cycling cards, which means that cards need to perform multiple roles or else be utterly fantastic at their main job. For ETB creatures, the mages were a great starting point. 3-mana 2/2 wizards that tutor for an artifact of a specific mana cost, and Sphinx Summoner was a similarly sweet inclusion. Tribute Mage finds Fluctuator, which is a key card for the deck since it gives great mana savings on cycling back-to-back cards, but aside from that, these cards mostly find secondary cards for the deck. So what about tutors to find the deck's key enchantments? Astral Slide and Co. Since I was already in Esper colors, a natural choice was Zur, a creature who can tutor out low-cost enchantments whenever he attacks. Conveniently, he's also a wizard, which brings me to a key piece of this deck, wizard cycling. There are 2 different wizard cycling cards in existence, which end up being solidly costed instant speed tutors that also count as a cycle for Astral Slide purposes. As an added bonus, one of these is a flash creature, which is grabbable with the newly printed MDFC Waterlogged Teachings. I got a chance to do this a couple weeks back, and there's nothing like the rush of tutoring to find a tutor to find a tutor to find an astral slide. Now, this may seem a bit deranged, and yeah, it kinda is, but it also points to a key facet of this deck, its status as a toolbox deck. This phrase means that the deck has a network of conditional tutors that can each find a certain selection of cards that the deck might need in various situations. For example, the deck's wizard cycling cards can find 4 tutors, as well as an excellent recursion card, and 3 cards for purposes of countering opposing spells and abilities. Worth pointing out is that all of these work with Astral Slide in some way, gaining additional value off of Slide, or finding Slide, or triggering Slide. Delving deeper into the toolbox, the most useful of the 3 artifact mages, Treasure Mage, can find life gain, a finisher, multiple types of removal, and a couple value sources. And the fact that it's repeatable with Astral Slide is a big deal, since it lets me load up on top-end threats that I can discard and then sharoom back out. Sphinx Summoner can find most of the stuff that Treasure Mage can, since most of them are artifact creatures, and it can also find a board wipe and an angsty bird. In addition to this selection of conditional tutors, there's also a couple cards from one of my favorite mechanics in all of Magic, Transmute. These are cards that allow their controller to pay 3 mana and discard them to tutor for a card of the same mana cost. I originally had the 3 mana enchantment tutor, Idyllic Tutor, in this deck, but honestly, a 3 mana Transmute card does a similar job of giving me access to key enchantments, and also gives me access to other useful things, like the recursion of Tameshi, the graveyard hate of Boggart Trawler, the graveyard feeding of Thirst for Knowledge, and so on, as well as being a very funny counterspell on top of it all. The cumulative effect of all of these individual, highly conditional tutors is striking. I have 6 other cards that can lead me to one of my 3 key Astral Slide enchantments, or one of my top-end artifact creatures, and I have 5 other cards that can lead me to Fluctuator, or Oversold Cemetery. I also have a lot of cards that can be grabbed by just 1 or 2 tutors, meaning that this deck ends up being a massive web of different tutors, which can each prompt me with interesting decisions to make. This quantity of tutors might sound objectionable to some, but well, hear me out. I'll get back to that objection. With the key cards and an overview of the toolbox out of the way, let's get to how this deck plays in practice. Early turns are spent sculpting a hand, ramping, and beginning to assemble value engines. There are a lot of cards that can be played out early and then Astral Slid later to reuse the ETBs. The Artifact Mages, my Sad Robots, my Angsty Bird, and so on. This early game can also be a time to feed the graveyard. Being able to sharoom out a massive artifact on turn 5 or 6 can offer a nice tempo swing that forces my opponents onto the back foot and gives me room to develop my advantage. I talk about this deck in terms of tempo and advantage because this deck is a control deck, through and through. You might not be able to tell this by looking at the deck. It's running a relatively high creature count of 35, and its commander is a generic artifact recursion card from Alara block. Its quantity of counterspells, while probably higher than average in raw terms, is nothing crazy, and consists mostly of spells which can also either be transmuted or cycled. It's also not running a single conventional board wipe. Sure, there's an incomplete wipe, a sleep effect, a multi-creature edict, and a couple things that reduce power and toughness based on the amount of mana put in, but nothing that says destroy all anything. So what makes this a control deck? Fundamentally, it comes down to this deck's play pattern. Highlighting my deck's Astral Slide targets in Architect immediately gives an indication of this. A big part of this deck's game plan is repeating value generation and removal, and that repeated removal can be some heavy-duty hate over the course of multiple turn cycles. More broadly, at any given moment in a game, this deck will be balancing 3 different goals: stay alive, suppress opponents, and build value. Staying alive means keeping my life total up and preventing opponents from winning. Suppressing opponents means taking actions that worsen my opponent's position in the game, and building value means doing things that improve my position in the game. The desirability of working toward these different goals runs from right to left. I love to build up my own value, I'm happy enough to take actions that slow down my opponents and make them less of a threat, and I don't really like needing to spend time and resources staying alive, but that one's pretty unnegotiable if I want to keep having a shot at winning a game. My chances of winning go up and up the more I get to focus on these right two. My ideal game is one where all of my energy can go into building up my own engine of ETB creatures and cycling spells, as well as neutralizing opposing engines and threats early in their lifespan. So that's the biggest feature of this deck, balancing these different elements. Early turns are spent building resources, getting blockers on board, and getting ready to answer anything my opponents are doing that is an existential threat to my position in the game. Since this is a toolbox deck, every suppression tool that I don't need to grab means a piece of value or ramp instead, and once I have Astral Slide in play, there will often be choices between flickering creatures that are suppressive or defensive in some way, and flickering ones that boost my game plan. As a result, threat evaluation is key to keeping opponents in check without losing too much momentum. The deck can make more daring early plays, but these often come at the cost of long-term value, so it's important to weigh the pros and cons, and to have follow-up plays in mind. One natural question might be, well, what do I mean by follow-up? How does this deck win? Well, as with most control decks, this deck is trying to reach a state of stability, where it has a lot of agency over the state of the game. This state will look different depending on the game because different tools will be required to keep different opposing decks in check. Here are a handful of things that might be true in the endgame scenario though, in no particular order. 1. A lot of mana, either through land counts built up by flickered robots, or Power Stone tokens that can pay for cycling costs. 2. A healthy hand of cards, especially one that includes multiple cycling cards as well as things like counterspells and recursion pieces. Nimble Obstructionist is especially nice, as it deals with a lot of pesky abilities that most control decks don't have a way to handle. 3. Utility permanents that keep the deck chugging along, such as engines that build value turn over turn, and permanents that can disrupt opposing attempts to regain footing. 4. A high life total that puts me out of range of dying to any number of common threats, as well as enough blockers to handle any sudden attacks. Once enough of these conditions are met, winning the game from there is usually straightforward. A key type of creature for this deck is medium to large flyers, a type which includes the commander, and these constitute a decent threat to life totals, given enough time. As long as I'm able to give them that time, they'll usually win me the game. However, there will be some games where an opponent will get a very high life total, or alternatively will be in a highly threatening position with a normal life total, so I run a couple finisher cards as well. One I alluded to earlier. Magister Sphinx is a fantastic card, giving me a way to rapidly burst down a problem player. This can be extremely sudden for my opponents. On the second main phase before my turn, I can play a draw discard effect to discard Magister Sphinx, and then cycle something to flicker Shroom and bring back Magister Sphinx, turning an opponent's life total to 10. Then, on my turn, I can cycle a couple more things to clear out any flying blockers before one-shotting the problem opponent, who could have been at any life total a single turn earlier. The other finisher I run is Herald of the Forgotten. This can bring back any of my 14 cycling creatures in my graveyard, and importantly it can also bring back any of my 14 cycling lands. This is great. It's usually a burst of creatures to contest the board, but also a burst of ramp to fuel my later turns. This second part is so big for the deck because the creatures don't even need to be impactful. Even if it's just some extra blockers, it also gives me a burst of resources, fueling both my staying alive and building value goals. So that's basically the deck. It's a highly flexible, cycling-based control deck with graveyard, artifact, and wizard packages woven throughout. There are a lot of more common play patterns, such as flickering a key creature like Angel of the Ruins or Treasure Mage with Astral Slide, but also a lot of more niche play patterns. For example, if I have a lot of mana and opposing value is mostly based around creatures being untapped, Monstrosity of the Lake can be flickered every turn to keep opposing stuff permanently slept. This isn't a common play, but the fact that Monstrosity has island cycling makes it a low investment card to include in the deck. Another niche play is using Oversold Cemetery and Nimble Obstructionist as a stifle engine, which can keep a key opposing effect that triggers once a turn suppressed. A couple other interesting plays. Tameshi can turn MDFCs and cycling lands to hand to be used later, and Currency Converter can protect key artifacts from sorcery speed graveyard hate. For a somewhat saucier play, Perplex can be followed up with another counterspell to bait an opponent into discarding their hand for 3 mana, in exchange for absolutely no benefit. I just keep on discovering new ways to play this deck, and that fact also provides a great advantage when it comes to resiliency. No matter what my opponents remove, or how my opponents slow me down, I have a way to play around it and keep building advantage in some way or other. The recursion suite of this deck is quite robust, and this is also a rare deck that actually has good access to stifle effects to deal with graveyard hate. Even without its graveyard, the deck can still build value around its Astral Slide effects, since the deck's high density of cycling cards means that all that's needed to have a value engine is an Astral Slide style enchantment and an ETB creature. At least one of these two things, graveyard-based value building and astral slide-based value building is usually necessary to keep up, but those two things can take a countless number of different forms, and there are lots of smaller packages riddled throughout the deck that can pose decent threats all on their own. The fact that there are so many different themes that are so interconnected in the deck means that pivots are much easier than they would be in most other decks. The fact that my core card is Astral Slide means that I have a way to resist creature board wipes and a way to break parity on creature-based stacks effects on hand almost always. The fact that most of my game actions are abilities rather than spells also insulates me against a lot of conventional hate for fiddly control decks. The fact that my deck runs lots of unique effects and conditional tutors means that I can simply avoid tutoring for a specific effect, if there's currently hate for it lurking around. The fact that the deck derives its consistency from filtering and tutors allows Shroom to play a more supporting role, to simply be cast for a burst of value before hanging around as a beater until some Astral Slide shenanigans are ready to happen. The wide array of different play paths and effects in this deck is equally beneficial in making this deck resilient to hate and in making this deck interesting to play. Tutors, though. I did say I'd get back to them, and now is as good a time as any to address the many tutoring crimes of this deck. Tutors are a subject of contention within the casual EDH community, with many players seeing them as a sweaty CEDH tool that goes against the spirit of the format. Other players simply see them as boring, making decks more streamlined and formulaic rather than offering the wide diversity of plays that EDH should be about. I don't think anybody is necessarily wrong for their feelings about this. Tutors can be a formulaic tool for the sweatlords of the world. Anybody who has played against a natural ordered Craterhoof or a demonic tutored infinite combo can attest to this. Tutors can feel bland and deflating, just an extra copy of a powerful game-ending spell. It might be interesting to interrogate why they're more bland and deflating than that power card simply being drawn and played. My hunch is that it comes down to lucky top decks simply being accepted as a part of the game. But still, these sorts of plays don't make people feel good, and I don't think they're wrong for that. I myself don't really play unconditional tutors, tutors that can find any card in a player's library, because I don't find them very interesting. At the same time, the tarring of tutors as a universally boring tool is a bit wrong-headed. Tutors can find the easy win, but they can also find all sorts of things, such as a centerpiece engine that all sorts of other cards can build off of in cool and textured ways. I hear people say that tutoring up a card every game, having a secret commander, if you will, goes against the spirit of EDH, but if having easy access to a card, playing it every game, and coordinating other cards to work nicely with it goes against the spirit of EDH, then I really have no choice but to conclude that EDH goes against the spirit of EDH. Back it up, folks. The format was doomed from the start. No, tutors are not inherently boring, and the things that make them boring or not boring are what you do with them, same as any other type of card. In my case, conditional tutors actively make my deck more interesting. Tutors allow me to run a greater variety of cards, cards that interact in cool and complex ways, and it allows this because tutors improve my ability to find different sorts of cards from within my deck. There are some cards that just aren't great without at least some support from my core cards, and without tutors for those core cards, those wouldn't be good enough. There are other types of cards that perform a specific role, but who can't fill this role fully enough without tutors to find them. Absent ways to find my key cards, I'd be forced to run more generic cards, cards that are good by themselves and that fit into a smaller number of synergy roles, rather than the rich tapestry of synergy I'm able to fit into my deck. Through the power of tutors, I'm able to run very little generic ramp, generic draw, generic removal, and so on. My card choices get to be more interesting and more specific to my deck because I have a suite of conditional tutors to help me put things together, and that makes my deck more interesting. As with most decks, my game plan builds off of a few central node cards, but there's a ton of diversity in what things actually end up looking like because of how niche and creative my card choices were able to be. This isn't to say that tutors inherently make a deck interesting. There are decks I find less interesting that run a lot of tutors, and 4 of my 6 current decks that I play regularly run none at all, and I like to think that those decks aren't too boring. But having or not having tutors will impact the options that a deck can go with, and going tutorless will often mean sacrificing either power or specificity. You'll end up with a deck that's simpler and runs more generic cards, as the non-tutoring 4 of my 6 decks do to some extent, or you'll end up with a deck that doesn't play smoothly and might not be able to keep up and make its cool plays in a lot of games. As I said at the start of this video, this was a deck outside my normal comfort zone of deck building, both for the process of originally building it and for the process of updating it. There are a lot of potential reasons for this, but the biggest one is that this deck pushes beyond the bounds of the levels of synergy that I and most other EDH players are used to using. Running a bunch of different synergy packages in the same deck can be tricky, and doing it elegantly requires putting an intense degree of focus on the points of connectivity and places where different archetypes overlap. As a result, building this deck was basically a piecemeal project of adding different packages and cards that fit the rigorous requirements of the deck. I started with the 2 key cards and added Shroom once I decided on my color identity and that I wanted a commander with an ETB. The mages were added because they were artifact synergy cards that were also ETBs, and once I found wizard cycling as a way to connect cycling to these wizards, I was able to loop in Zur as a tutorable way to find my key enchantments. Tameshi was pulled into this wizard cycling package as well as a way to recur my 2 key card types, and Hall of Heliod's Generosity and Gaia Reach Sanitarium were added as land-based ways to recur and loot, respectively, once it was clear that land cycling had me covered for color fixing. Teresiare's Devastation made it in as a lovely ramp board wipe pairing in place of a hard wipe, and a few different MDFCs ended up being a great way to compress my slots even further to squeeze just that little extra bit of utility out of everything, as well as working well with Tameshi. Even late in the process, I'm still finding new ways to tighten up synergies just that extra little bit. Erdtai Resurrected was a recent addition to this deck as a card that counters spells and removes creatures as an ETB, and he's a wizard on top of it all. I still don't know if I've reached the most optimized and cohesive possible version of this deck. There are just so many cards that could possibly work in the deck depending on matchups I find myself in, more than I have time to test all of. I also don't know if I found the perfect blend of interaction yet. Recent playtesting has had the board wipes feeling a bit underrepresented and soft counterlocks on non-creature spells feeling overrepresented, but I have no idea if that pattern will hold in the long term. What you can take away from this is that building a hyper-connected synergy machine like this is a slow, creeping, iterative process. The lower-hanging fruits can be found from a Scryfall search in an afternoon, tossing all of the best cards with a particular word or phrase into a deck. But if you're trying to weave together a bunch of different things under tight constraints, it will be more of a process. The most important part of this process is finding nodes to build off of that pull different elements together, and then including only cards that perform multiple roles or that perform their primary role fantastically well. In this deck, that meant viciously scrutinizing any card that wasn't an artifact with a fetchable mana value, a cycling card, a key enchantment, a wizard, or an ETB creature. What survived that scrutiny? Not many cards. We've got some looters, some multimodal tutors, and a small handful of best-in-class cards. In a deck like this, it's also important to be able to weed out cards that might share a synergy pillar, but which aren't actually good enough. As far as cycling synergies go, Curator of Mysteries isn't actually worth playing as a creature, basically ever. Joe Grant isn't great for the same reason. Drakehaven isn't great outside of a go-wide creature deck, and Abandoned Sarcophagus is an actively bad card. Likewise, it might be tempting to load up on a bunch of nifty wizard synergy cards, but these aren't all that great either with the numbers of wizards this deck is running, and forcing in a wizard count high enough to make them good would tank other parts of the deck. Building an elaborate and meticulous synergy machine requires restraint above all else. You need to be able to resist the urge to throw cards in just because of a single idealized situation you constructed in your brain. What do cards look like in the less ideal half of situations you'll be finding them in? That's always an important thought to cycle through, and one that'll save you a lot of wasted time testing cards that realistically never had a chance of being a permanent fixture of a deck. The other thing you can take away from my endeavor here is that it's worth it to build a deck that's difficult to build. If the process I described in the last few minutes sounded hard, that's because it was. Building a deck like this is a challenge, but that's also what makes it such a gratifying exercise. Seeing the deck actually work out after I put hours into tuning it is satisfying, and figuring out new ways I can smooth over some rough edges in it is also satisfying. The fact that I still have a large maybe board in paper and a mental list of pivots I could try for solving various problems is exciting, and forcing myself to engage with a deck like this has undoubtedly made me a stronger deck builder. This interlocking synergy machine type of deck is the one I personally find hardest to build, but your difficult to build deck style might be different. Whatever it is though, you should take a crack at it. It's difficult to fight back against a deck building weakness, but the resulting decks can be really cool. That pretty well sums up the video. However, I have an announcement. It's a birthday party for my Discord server. Okay, what I mean to say is that I'm running another deck building challenge. That challenge goes as follows. Build a deck using one of the following choose a background commanders. Ellen Harbreeze Busybody, Halcyon Emerald Archdruid, Amber Gristleomal, Alora Merry Thief, and Viconia Drow Apostate. They can be paired with any background that appeals to you. A top deck for each commander will be selected and highlighted in a future video, and judging criteria will be, as last time, creativity, cohesion, and likelihood to produce dynamic gameplay. And this time, there's a prize. The creator of each of the top decks will receive a Haunted One altar, hand-painted by my friend Mechacatten, who did the art for my channel banner and profile picture. If that sounds up your alley, you can find out more info about the challenge in my Discord server, and you'll want to submit a deck by noon PST on Tuesday the 21st. As always, I want to thank my patrons for supporting what I do here, allowing me to make high-effort videos like this one without needing to worry too much about how they'll fare in the algorithm. Submissions for this month's deck review will run until the end of tomorrow, so if you want a chance at getting your deck reviewed by me, you can check that out. If you want more of me and don't want to pay money, I was on an episode of the Magic Mirror podcast that should be releasing around the same time as this video, and there I go further into my feelings about Tutors, along with my two co-hosts. A link to that is in the description. Alright. Bye now.